Okay, now I get to ask the question. Who are you and what makes you optimistic?
My name's Jon Grinspan. I'm curator of political history at the Smithsonian American History Museum just across the mall. And the thing I focus on that makes me optimistic is really pessimism in the past, that I study the bad old days of American democracy, the period in the late 19th century when people were really frustrated with their political system, when people are very driven by an angry, partisan, tribal system that's really negative forms of engagement, that's really driven by rage in many ways. And the thing that I find optimistic about studying this era is you see that it ends. You see that somehow over the course of a generation between the end of the Civil War and 1900 or so, Americans manage to right themselves, and they pull out of this downward spiral of frustration and rage and come up with many of the norms we're used to in American democracy today, that many of the things we worry about today were invented out of this fight against rage and against anger and driven really by optimism. So every time I look at a document of a stolen election or a political riot or assassination, you get the sense that they found their way out somehow, and that makes me optimistic, honestly.
Okay, so how'd they do it and what lessons for us?
Well, they don't know. Well, no one knows how they did it, but I think one of the driving things you see is a cautious optimism, that initially this era begins after the Civil War with really booming optimism. The country has been reunited, slavery has been beaten, secession is over, and there's a really brittle sense of optimism, that American democracy is triumphant and flawless and will solve all our problems. And people who are excited about this moment come into the next moment with almost unreasoning expectations. And as they begin to feel pulled down over the course of the next generation, their brittle optimism breaks, and it turns into pessimism, and it turns into a really negative downward spiral of political anger. And this is the term when throw the bums out this is the time when the term throw the bums out emerges as a political term, because there's just a sense of you throw out one political boss and you get another and another. And that lasts for a long time, until the 1890s, 1900, when a new generation rises that they kind of start out with a little bit of disillusionment. They don't have this unreasoning optimism, and they're just a little cautiously optimistic. That Lincoln Steffens, who's the great muckraker from this period, who studies how political machines work, says all our governments are bad and all our people are optimists. That they just want to know how the system works. And in these kind of cautious steps and kind of restrained sense of politics, they really manage to remake their world.
Okay. First, I want to thank you for making the long commute across the mall. Thank you for that long journey.
I can flee at any time, too. It's nice.
Let me throw a theory at you, because I think about this period some, because it's so like our own. They have a big economic transition, big wave of immigration, a lot of political corruption. And so my theory is this: it happened in 3 steps. First, there was a religious revival. Social Darwinism was replaced by the social gospel movement. Second, there was a civic revival. You had all these groups like the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Settlement House, Jane Addams. So it went religious, civic, and then later progressives, a political revival. And so you sort of need a change in culture first. Do you see that change in culture happening then, or was there some other order?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would add to that order is that you have to start at the bottom, as you were saying. That we talk about the progressive era as this period when we got clean air and clean water and food and women getting the right to vote and all these reforms. But the first thing they tackle is a sense that the political system is flawed, that there's mass dislocation, social disruption in 19th century America with immigration, with industrialization. People feel removed from their roots. People don't live with the families they grew up with. People live in boarding houses and they eat in saloons from free lunches. They feel removed from all the community that you were talking about, and they hide in partisanship. Partisanship is really high in this era because here's an organization that has your back no matter what. And there's no answer in partisanship, that no matter which party is in power, and they're both flawed, they just make each other worse almost, and they drag each other down. And around the turn of the century, they invent almost the concept of independence in politics, that you vote independently as an individual. And you can see this in physical objects. For instance, when you voted in the 19th century, there's a ballot box in town square, and you gather with the community of people who are allowed to vote, and they put ballots in the box. And it's this big mass moment. And there's a lot of pressure of how you're going to vote and a lot of political violence. In the 20th century, they introduced things like voting curtains. You vote alone in a booth by yourself. You ask your individual conscience how you vote. And it really develops a sense of political independence, that people should be active as their own self, not within these tribal partisan organizations that they look to for defense.
Now, where would you, one of my heroes is Jane Addams, as I mentioned, who lived in Chicago, created these community centers, and really has a lot to teach us about how to, like, all of our social institutions were built for raising kids on the prairie in Kansas, and suddenly there are millions of immigrants in Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia, and they had to deal with it. And what struck me was how big they thought. So like, they had, the Boy Scouts was big, the Forest Service was big, the unions, the NAACP. It feels like we have a lot of social entrepreneurs, but we don't quite build as big as they did. I don't know why that is.
They really remake their democracy, and there's good and there's bad. It's not that they fix a problem, they introduce new problems. They damage voter turnout, for instance, and voter turnout has been much lower in our own era than it was back then. But they really are willing to look at a political institution that they see as the bedrock of their society and adjust it. Fundamentally, voting rights, the role of the press, the role of leaders, the civility to each other in public, political restraint. They tackle all these elements really bravely. And I do think you're right that they're bolder than we've gotten yet, but when I look at the way political conversations are going in this country, I do see that renewed sense that we're gonna tackle a big thing. We're gonna talk about democracy with a capital D and really reassess it.
Yeah, now you mentioned something I wanted to ask you about, which is that it was bottom up. When I think of the progressives, I think of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson later, and Herbert Crowley, and they seem top down to me.
It's a mix. I think it is mostly top down, or it's middle out, because really the population that's most frustrated with this political system is this new middle class in America that finds its roots in and tries to reform the political system. And they do, like I said, they do some damage in the process. You have a less working class politics in the 20th century than you do in the 19th century, but they inculcate this new sense of kind of cautious optimism and restraint in politics. All our norms of civility and how people should behave with each other when they're in conflict are introduced by this population. I mean, we're talking about, previous to this, the most violent period in American politics. It comes after the Civil War, not before, with Reconstruction in the South, with labor unrest, with two political parties that operate like criminal syndicates at times. There are 3 presidential assassinations in 36 years in the end of the 19th century, and they build in a new sense of civility. And some of it comes from faith, and some of it comes from just a renewed optimism in how people can interact with each other.
My grandfather used to draw me maps of his neighborhood on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and he would say, this building was the Finnish building, this was the German, these were the Dutch, these were the Jews, these were the Russians. How did they deal with diversity? Because they had a lot of it in those days.
Yeah, well, the one good thing that the parties are really adept at is dealing with diversity, in that this protecting institution wants voters. And so they'll take Irish voters, they'll take Jewish voters, they'll take Finnish voters. But at the same time, because they build up animosities, they really aren't bringing people together as much as they're sapping off those populations. So one of the things that happens is there's a blurring of those divisions more over time, that people are much more conscious of their ethnic background in the beginning of this period than in the end of it. And the Irish only drink with the Irish, and they only drink whiskey, and the Germans only drink with the Germans, and they only drink beer. And they introduce over time institutions like the saloon, like the union, like these institutions that bridge people together really successfully.
Let me ask you a little meta question about your profession and what you try to achieve with your profession. I was a history major, a double major in history and celibacy at the University of Chicago.
They go together so often.
Yeah, they do go together. It's funny. But once I was in the Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois, and they took me to the vault, and they let me hold the dress. When Lincoln was shot at Ford Theater, the actress came up from stage and held his head in her lap. And they let me touch that dress, and it had blood all over it. Yeah. And it was like a moment of, people describe it as historical ecstasy, just like touching another era. It felt weirdly magical. Why did you go into history in this work, in this institution? Like, what's your mission?
Oh, that's a big question. That's bigger than why are you optimistic? I went into history because it was this portal into human empathy. There's a way to engage with people in the past. 100 billion people have lived and died on this planet, and we limit ourselves to the people in front of us, which is crucial, but there's all these stories, there's all these human populations, and sometimes they're easier to get at when they died 200 years ago. In terms of the mission, one of the things we do at the Smithsonian that's really interesting is we study the past and try to prepare the future to study us. So one of the things I do is I go out to conventions, rallies, protests, and try to figure out what objects from today would tell those stories in 100 years. What could you put behind glass to sum up the 2016 election or the moment we're in now? And you look back at the dress or the Lincoln cup, which is the last cup he drank coffee out of before his assassination, and you think, what would there be today? How can you tell this next story to the people who come after us?
Yeah, it's super hard. I covered Europe in the 1990s, and I thought I was in the front of big history, the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Berlin Wall, Mandela coming out of prison. I covered all that stuff. But the event that seemed most symptomatic now in retrospect was the Yugoslav Civil War, because it was the beginning of ethnic nationalism and authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So it's so hard to get it. If there was something today that would make you excited, is there some object you'd want the Smithsonian to have?
There's one I'm really excited about that we're getting that. What, you mean for the present or the
Well,
past?
go with your excitement on that.
Okay, you said you look for the big events, but I think really big events are made up of many little events. And there was a guy who lived in New Hampshire in the late 19th century, and he marched in political demonstrations, and he carried the staff with a torch, because they had torchlit marches, and he marked off every election he marched in with the date on the staff. So it says 1860, 1864, 1868 for each presidential election. And it goes till 1904, and he hangs around until he's kind of an old kook. But you can see democratic engagement inscribed in paint on wood. That this is the beauty of this stuff. That here's this human being's experience, and you can boil it down to this one physical object.
Okay, well, you study history, John. I am history. I'm leaving, so thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.